Hello, and welcome to Warhammer 40k's Grim History from Beyond. I'm Zeckthar.
And I'm Yuksen.
We are the chroniclers of all that was, and all that will be in the 41st millennium. We've seen the rise and fall of many empires, and this month we'll be discussing the backbone of the Imperium of Man, the Astra Militarum.
Indeed, and this week we'll be discussing the mightiest heroes of the Imperial God. Well, at least the ones we haven't already talked about.
That's right, Yuksen. But why don't we start with the most famous guardsman ever to have lived? Lord Commander Poul Macharius.
Right on!
Now, Macharius rose to prominence in the early 41st millennium during a time towards the end of what is known by most historians as
The Waning.
Now, the Waning was a relatively undefined era of the age of the Imperium that lasted from the early 38th millennium until about 744.M41.
Really? That seems a strange time for the Macharius Crusade. And quite frankly, from what I know of the Crusade, it was anything other than undefined.
You are absolutely right, Yuksen. The era is characterized by a slow degradation of the Imperium's stability, power, and peace as new chaos and Xenos threats assaulted the Emperor's worlds. Quite frankly, a lot took place during this time. It's just things that the Imperium doesn't like to talk about much.
Like what? If I recall right, by the conclusion of the Macharius Crusade, young Macharius had conquered thousands of worlds of the Imperium. In fact, the only other person to conquer more worlds was the Emperor himself during the Great Crusade.
All of that is true, and I will be getting into it. But you know how last week I asked you to put a pin in those thoughts and we come back later to it?
Yes?
I would like you to do that again. You're kind of jumping farther ahead into my chronicling. But to answer your question, I have talked about a few major events that took place during this time, mainly the 9th through the 12th Black Crusades. The last Black Crusade being known as the Gothic War, when Abaddon acquired his Blackstone fortresses. And the first time we actually saw the Planet Killer. Ironically, by the way, everybody thought the Planet Killer was destroyed during the Gothic War, but then it shows back up in the 13th Black Crusade. Ta-da! Anyways.
Gotta love those loopholes, right?
It was
gone! Really? Nah. It always comes back.
The Imperium thought it was gone. Let's put it that way. They're like,
It's
oh, good,
like-
it's gone. There's no way it could possibly still be around.
Saint Celestine, she's gone! But is she really?
All
Is
right.
she really?
You said, I think we're going down the rabbit hole. We got to get back to our hero. Now,
You
Macharius,
mean another hero, right?
yeah. All right. Now, Macharius is born in 356.M41 as the heir of planetary governor Pela of the civilized world of Donia in the Segmentum Pacificus, and by his early 20s was a renowned general of the Astra Militarum. His brilliant leadership during the suppression of the Roxanne Rebellion, where he rescued Lord Commander Solar Phillips, first brought Macharius to the attention of the High Lords of Terra. Phillips recognized the military genius of Macharius and took him under his wing, naming him his successor as Lord Commander Solar. It was also during this time that Macharius met the men who would go on to lead his armies: Sejanus, Borgan Crassus, Tarka, Arian, Lysander of Coropoli, and Cyrus of Laurentine. They were a brave and brash group of lads that earned Macharius' trust and friendship, spending many of their early years testing their leadership qualities through acts of heroism on the battlefield. Yet destiny waits for no man, and in 386.M41, Lord Solar Phillips was killed in the Lamort landings, and Macharius inherited his command of the military forces of the Segmentum Solar, the youngest person in Imperial history ever to rise to the position of Lord Commander. Macharius traveled to Terra for the first and last time during his inauguration for the new position, taking direct command of the new forces under his control. He oversaw a string of early conquests on the worlds of Land's End, Morbellum, and Jalfazi III, with his Donian army of Astra Militarum regiments drawn from his homeworld. It was at this point that Macharius expressed his desire to launch the greatest Imperial crusade since the Great Crusade at the dawn of the Imperium itself. With Macharius' reputation and the resources at his command, it did not take long to assemble an imperial armada, greater than any that had headed into the unknown void, to that time since the days when the emperor still walked among humanity. The Macharian Crusade began its expedition into the unknown of the world of Macaria, now a shrine world of the Adeptus Ministorum in the Segmentum Pacificus. It was there that the Lord Solar Macharius rallied his troops before boarding the waiting transports in orbit above the planet. Then the expedition set off to new worlds in unexplored space all the way to the galactic rim, beyond the reach of even the sacred telepathic beacon of the Emperor's Astronomicon. Many of these worlds had once been part of the Imperium of Man, but had lost contact with the Emperor's realm during the chaos of the Age of Apostasy in the early 36th millennium. The first major battle of the Macharian Crusade took place against the cult of the Angel of Fire, which ruled over the Karsk system. Now, during the campaign, the cult was revealed to be a front for the worship of the chaos god Tzeentch, and a wounded Macharius faced down the greater demon known as the Lord of Change, that was the Angel of Fire, which provided the cult's namesake, rejecting his promises of power through chaos and remaining pure in the sight of the Emperor. Yet this was merely the start. As the Macharian Crusade ground on across the extreme western edges of the Segmentum Pacificus and into the halo stars. During this time, they met many alien human civilizations, and conquering most. While there were far too many stories of mighty deeds to tell during this time, we'll try to be brief on some of the few more notable moments of this period. Now, in 392.M41, the high world of Persepolis was recontacted by the Imperium after 5,000 standard years. Macharius and his troops of the First Army Group joined General Sejanus' Second Army Group to fight across the deserts of the world of Gradosia. Macharius discovered the tomb of an ancient imperial explorer, Indi Jonah the Vagrant, and took his golden-winged relic helm as a prize that he would wear for the rest of the crusade. The next year, one of the most notable operations of the crusade was a battle against Chaos Space Marines on the world of Zaga 4. During the fighting, a bolter round embedded itself in Macharius' chest but failed to explode. The ecclesiarchy confessors accompanying the crusade declared it to be a miracle and a sign of the emperor's grace and love for Macharius. Now, during the years of 395 to 397.M41, General Borgen Crassus launched an assault against the highly advanced independent human civilization that controlled the world of Adrantis 5. Its advanced technology impressed the Solar Commander, so much so that he stated,
"We have turned to the dark centuries of science and created many new and wondrous machines."
Because of these advanced technologies, Adrantis 5 held Macharius' advance at bay, during which time General Crassus' 5th Army Group lost 90% of its combat strength in the grinding attritional warfare. Now, in the end, Adrantis 5 only fell to the Lord Solar after Macharius ordered a comet to be redirected to the world, destroying the planet. Upon its destruction, Macharius was quoted saying, "Of its secrets, nothing now remains." Now, after the conclusion of the campaign against Adrantis 5, the Macharian Crusade forces encountered a massive orc, whose war boss managed to inflict debilitating injuries on Macharius. For a time, the entire crusade stood on a knife's edge, but the Lord Solar recovered and continued his headlong drive into unexplored space. Overall, in the first standard year of the crusade, 100 worlds fell to Macharius' conquest. In the second year, 300 more would be added to the Emperor's realm. By the third year of operations, nearly 700 planets had fallen to Macharius' combined armies. Each world so conquered had its population either systematically ground down until there were too few natives left to oppose the imperial advance, or was brought under the direct dominion of the Imperium in a conscious imitation of the policies that had created the Imperium during the Great Crusade in the late 30th millennium. In the wake of Macharius' conquering army, always came the missionaries of the ecclesiarchy and teams from the Inquisition to spread the faith of the God Emperor to the heathen, eliminate any heretics, mutants, or witches to be found amidst the conquering population, and reestablish full imperial control over the new additions to mankind's domain. By the end of the crusade in 399.M41, Macharius' army stood undefeated and at the very west edge of the galaxy, deep within the Halo Zone, and at the very limits of the Astronomicon's telepathic beacon. The region beyond was cut off from the Imperium, and the home to civilizations that had never known the light or peace. Peace of the Emperor of Mankind. Sure, we'll go with that. Anyways.
We'll talk about that later.
Right.
Yes, we'll talk about that later.
At this point, Macharius' generals and troops finally wavered in the resolve to continue into the darkness, beyond the boundaries of the Emperor's light. They pleaded with the Lord Solar to reconsider advancing into the dark void of the Halo stars, which officially marked the limits of the Astronomicon and the protection of the Emperor. His fleet would be greatly slowed in that region of space due to the difficulties navigators would have in negotiating the currents of the warp beyond the range of the Astronomicon. And his astropaths would be beyond the range of telepathic communication back to Imperial space. Now, while all of this was true, the bigger problem was Macharius' troops were simply tired and suffered from low morale after years of intense and grinding battles on hundreds of worlds across thousands of light years of space. Many of his troops were also fearful of what lay beyond, as many of the scout teams sent into the Halo Zone had never returned, and those that did told of strange phenomenons, of haunted stars and entire worlds inhabited by what they could only describe as ghosts and spirits. Faced with this refusal to advance, Macharius became furious and accused his troops and commanders of betrayal and cowardice. He locked himself in his stateroom, drinking himself into a drunken stupor. When Macharius finally emerged, clean and sober once more, he ordered his fleet to set course back to Imperial space. His guardsmen cheered that the Lord Solar was a hero and a living saint of the Imperium, and his generals breathed a deep sigh of relief. However, Macharius was a frustrated man whose dreams of boundless conquest in the name of the God Emperor had been shattered. It is said at this moment, facing the blackness of the void, beyond the light of the Astronomicon, and the realization that he would be unable to conquer any more worlds in the name of the Emperor of Mankind, he fell to his knees and wept, a man broken by the human frailties of those around him, which he did not share. His will to live broken by his men's refusal. On the return journey to Imperial space in 400.M41, Macharius finally succumbed to a jungle fever. He had contracted on the world of Juka, his soul ascending to join the Emperor. Despite their early refusal to continue the crusade, Macharius' troops deeply mourned the passing of their general and revered him as a saint of the Imperial Creed, a second coming of the ancient Primarchs.
Really? You just gave up and died?
I thought you might have a problem with that. Now, according to the Imperial records and the Ecclesiarchy, this is how the great mortal man and commander of the Imperium died. The truth, however, is far darker. According to records held by the Inquisition, what really happened was while battling his traitorous ex-protege, Richter, who is said to have turned to worshipping Nurgle, Macharius contracted several deadly diseases, besieging the traitor world of Loki, and may have only had weeks to live. Macharius was eventually able to kill Richter, but was in turn killed by a member of the Officio Assassinorum, disguised as an inquisitorial stormtrooper, with the cooperation of Inquisitor Hieronymus Drake, who may have been sabotaging Macharius' war effort on Loki. However, to suppress the truth of the incident, the assassin then killed Drake as well, and the reasons and figures behind this conspiracy are left ambiguous. Now, whatever the reason for his death, Macharius' body was returned to Macaria, where the crusade had originally begun. A massive state funeral was held there for the Lord Commander Solar, which was attended by the High Lords of Terra, cardinals of the Ecclesiarchy, the Magi of the Adeptus Mechanicus, and many other important figures of the Imperium wishing to pay their respects to one of the greatest leaders the realm of the Emperor had ever seen. 1 million troops led the funeral procession. 100 Astra Militarum generals laid their swords on his ornate sarcophagus. Not long after his death, the Adeptus Ministorum officially recognized what many had known for years, and Macharius was canonized as a saint of the Imperial cult. Macaria was transformed into a shrine world dedicated to the former Lord Solar, and millions of pilgrims from across the Imperium made the long journey every Terran year to visit the Grand Imperial Cathedral, erected over his final resting place. The Macharius Crusade was a brief glimmer of light and hope for the Imperium, a short time where men and women remember the time of the emperor, where humanity was the master of the galaxies. Yet this time to bask in the light was short, because following the death of Macharius, his new additions to the imperial space fell into anarchy during a 70 standard year civil war known as the Macharian heresy. Macharius' various commanders soon fell to squabbling amongst themselves over who should command his expedition, and many sought to carve out their own personal domains amongst the worlds Macharius had conquered. The Imperium was ultimately forced to send a new expedition, this time comprised of many chapters of the Adeptus Astartes, to restore imperial authority in the newly conquered regions. And even they did not completely succeed. Okay, well, I'm actually done. Go ahead, brother. Release the pin.
I love the phrase, the peace of the Imperium, the peace of the Emperor.
Yeah. That's how it's written down anyways by the Imperium.
Oh, sorry. Peace of the Emperor of mankind. Yeah.
Yeah. That one kind of amused me too.
Let it be known that in some cases, some people would view living underneath the rule of orcs being a better life than living under Imperium rule.
Yeah, but those people are crazy. Those are just nut jobs. We can't compare them, Yuksen. Humans do not do well with orcs. Let's just put it that way.
At least it's much simpler, and you don't have to immediately go, are they about to come and get me? You know if they are, because, well, first of all, they aren't coming to get you. They're just going to get you. But that's beside the point.
Anyways, back to Macharius.
Yeah. I believe there were a couple of the generals that actually were steadfast afterwards. I think Crassus was one.
Quite frankly, anyways, it was just the whole bickering between these guys. And yes, some of them did remain with the Imperium, but others decided that they were going to have their own little empire. Which,
yeah,
right.
That never goes wrong.
Yeah, that always works out. Well, it might work out anyways if you're past the Astronomicon. I'm sure there's actually plenty of empires past there.
Just not human ones.
Well, maybe even human ones. But remember, they've never known the light and peace of the Imperium. They've made their own peace.
Yeah. Actual peace.
Yeah, but what do you think of Macharius, man? And especially anyways, the time period anyways that this all kind of took place, because you were kind of interested in that. But yeah.
Okay, so I like Macharius, how he was able to, instead of some people just going when he's told basically we aren't going to be able to go any further, how he didn't go, I'll shoot you all, like some gung-ho people tend to do in the Imperium. He did break down temporarily because, let's face it, it was his dream to continue on. Right. But he at least acknowledged it within a day, for that matter.
By the way, it wouldn't surprise me anyways if he did threaten to shoot a bunch of people. But just upon realizing anyways that everybody literally was going, no, we're not going any farther.
Yeah. But
you can shoot us all. We're not moving another inch. That was kind of the way that I kind of interpreted that.
But the fact that he was able to come back actually after, drinking himself in a stupor, but the next day coming back and going, okay, fine, and accepting it instead of just being like continuing on grinding them into the dust on the way back or continuously punishing them.
Well, do you really think that he accepted it?
I think he accepted the fact that they weren't going to be able to continue on.
Right. I'm wondering anyways if during that time of drunken stupor anyways he realized, oh, wait a minute, this is just northwest. There's all these other places we can go anyways in the Imperium and do the same thing. Like the Segmentum Pacificus. So I wonder if once he got back anyways, he was just kind of like, and he got really upset because he couldn't, keep going in the direction he was going, but realized, I've still got this giant army. We could always go, like north or west or south or something, Let's build this thing back to what it was before. I wonder if that's why he kind of rejuvenated himself. I don't know. I don't think it's ever recorded anyways that he had plans for going other places, but I think a lot of that also has to do with the simple fact that he never made it back.
Well, and judging from the fact that he did have to deal with some of apparently at least one of his commanders went rogue even before he died.
Richter, yeah.
I'm thinking that another thing that may have popped in his head once he was thinking more clearly was maybe I should be taking a look at who's left.
Right. Maybe reforming his army.
Who will stay true, because especially after Richter went rogue, I would be, at least I'm pretty sure he was
side-eyed.
Thought this would be maybe I should be looking into who should be left in charge of where and who is actually loyal to the Empire right now.
Right. Well, okay, so I guess my question for you, anyways, I guess, is that do you think, anyways, if he had made it back, he would have started another crusade somewhere else after he had reestablished and regrouped his army, like you were saying? You think he would have marched out somewhere else, or do you think he would have tried to just kind of keep the stronghold, so to speak, make sure that that population that he'd already conquered kind of remained solidly within the Imperium?
I think the latter of the two. And the reason why I think that is because he knew by that time that basically his forces were tired. They're low on morale. I would be looking at him, and I'm pretty sure he'd be looking at him and go, okay, another conquest with these people would just, it wouldn't work anymore. It would just crumble if they're already at this breaking point.
Part of me agrees with you, but another part of me thinks, anyways, I mean, Macharius was a conqueror. And from what I've seen, anyways, like, for instance, in the history of Terran 42, conquerors normally don't sit idle long. They normally tend to go back and reconquer or go out and continue to conquer. But there is, I think, anyways, what you were talking about, there is a significant amount of time, at least the smart ones, do go back. They do regroup. They do try to, re-stimulate their armies, build morale back up again before they go back out questing, so to speak.
Yeah, that's what I was figuring that he would be more likely to do.
Okay. Instead of doing the whole fortress thing?
And no, him, at the same time, basically rebuilding his forces, also having to set up and make sure that what he had gained actually stays in place.
Maybe take a few generals.
Apparently, he hadn't done quite yet.
Well, he was on his way back anyways. And I think, honestly, anyways, as he was coming back, that was kind of, it wouldn't shock me anyways if he was already starting to work on that.
Yeah.
Like a lot of these guys anyways that are tired and kind of lost their morale. It's like, guess what? You now get to retire on this planet. Kind of thing.
Mind you, you will technically still be part of the Imperial Guard. It's just you are now the de facto PDFs.
Well, that, or he might even just let him straight up retire on some of those planets that they had, like, ground all the civilians into dust. I mean, that way, at least you have a whole. Hang on, that way at least you have a whole population of like loyal subjects that are there,
right?
And then you can start the rebuilding process of retithing and new Imperial Guard units marching out. So, I mean. When I look at Macharius, I don't see him as an empire builder. I see him as a conqueror. Now, there's a difference. So real quick, before we get into, I figured anyways, but I thought you had a brilliant idea anyways. You're like, well, this is probably the most famous Lord Solar ever. We should talk about the guy that's here now, which I think is a brilliant idea. But before we get to him, I want to kind of compare anyways a couple of people here real quick. And I know this is going to seem unfair, but Macharius and Rabute Gilman. Okay. So when I look at Macharius, I don't see him anyways the same way that I see Rabute Gilman, on the concept that Gilman builds empires. He's all about anyways the structure of how things work. He's all about the supply chain management. He's about the economy, and along with anyways, building strong forces and slowly developing an empire. When I look at Macharius, on the other hand, I see him anyways of out of the two of them, quite frankly, if it was, okay, I got a whole bunch of people anyways, and I want you to go conquer something, I would probably take Macharius over Guilliman.
Yeah.
Because that's what he does. He's just like, I got it, you know?
So in my mind, the comparison would be more like Brute Gilman's, I will build up forces and slowly expand, whereas in my mind, Macharius would be, I'll expand and then I'll start building up what I've conquered.
Well, and that's the crux of the matter, though, is that I don't know if Macharius, well, and quite frankly, we don't know because he died. I don't know if he was any good anyways at that latter part that you're talking about. We know that Guilliman had that in spades. But with Macharius, we just don't know because he never made it back. So we don't know anyways how good he would be at
doing it that way is more issues can occur if you have to go backwards to re-fortify things. That's my point.
It also kind of depends on how you do it too. I mean, if you take, for instance, probably one of the greatest conquerors ever, Julius Caesar, when he conquered the Visigoths, or not the Visigoths, the Gauls. My bad. Visigoths were much later in the Roman Empire, but he conquered pretty much all the Gauls, and he took over most of Europe. But I mean, and they always kind of had problems with the Gauls afterwards, but there was a long period of time where Caesar was still around, where they were still kind of cool with him because they're just like, okay, you beat us. Not to mention the fact that a lot of his veterans he actually let keep land in Gaul. That also helped too. And for a while, anyways, he didn't really have as many problems with them. In fact, actually, the northern parts of Italy became quite civilized over a period of time. But like I said, it depends. But then again, Julius Caesar was significantly more, anyways, in my opinion, more like
Guilliman.
Brute Guilliman. Yeah. He had a better idea, anyways, of after he conquered a people, what to do with them. Other than just grinding them into paste, and then there's only like 5 of them left who hate you because you killed their entire planet.
Well, not all of the plants were like that, remember?
Right.
Some of them.
I'm just saying. But yeah, quite frankly, Macharius. So if you took those two guys and you looked at Terran 42's history, Macharius reminds me a lot more of Alexander the Great.
Yeah.
Never lost a battle. Probably one of the greatest conquerors. He's up there with, I mean, most people think he is the greatest conqueror. I don't know. You could debate him or Genghis Khan or Kublai Khan or both up there too.
Genghis Khan didn't conquer as much as Alexander the Great. It's just that he also laid the groundwork for his predecessors to expand it.
That's why I said Kublai Khan, because he really, really expanded it. But then again, anyways, Alexander the Great also was very similar in the fact, anyways, that his career was very, very short. He pretty much conquered all of Greece, all of Persia. He went down, he conquered Egypt. He went all the way to India. And that's when his troops just said, no, we're done. And then he never made it back to Greece because he died. So very similar there. But I don't know. What do you think? If you had, okay, so if both these guys were still alive. Well, actually, here's another kind of interesting question. If both these guys were still alive, do you think Guilliman would actually have led the Indominus Crusade, or do you think he would have had Macharius do it?
You know what? I think what he would do is he'd have Macharius do it while he basically came behind and actually built the empire behind it.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree.
Because
and quite frankly, go ahead.
Macharius actually resembles more of the emperor in this situation than Guilliman. Because the emperor was very much, I will just try to conquer everything. But if you notice, he left so many fractured worlds because he hadn't really built up the empire part of it.
The emperor?
Yeah.
The emperor did a pretty good job. It was kind of crushed back anyways by the guy he left in charge. That was his mistake. He left Horus in charge. I think we've already established this. The emperor's big mistake was he left Horus in charge and didn't tell him anything and then left. But anyways, we could, I mean, quite frankly, by the way, that would be Honestly, that would be the return of the glory days of the Great Crusade if you could have Macharius and Rabute Gilliman working side by side like that. I mean, quite frankly, I don't think anything could stop them.
Too bad Call was a little late on the time frame of him bringing back Gilliman.
Okay, so I think unless you got something else you want to talk about Macharius, I think it is time for you to discuss, what's his face? Arcadian Leontus? I think I got his name right,
Yeah.
right?
Yes.
Okay. Well done. Tell us about
Not
him.
Leonidas, it's Leontus.
I always get that name mixed up. Go ahead, sir.
Now, his full name, along with his dizzying tally of titles, privileges, and ostentatious ranks, places him among the Imperium's highest echelons of nobility. And as Lord Commander Solar, he is responsible for all Astra Militarum forces within the Segmentum Solar. He hails from one of Terra's noblest and oldest families, one with a peerless lineage of service to the Emperor dating back countless of generations. A product of Terra's opulent hive city spires and greatest military academies, Leontus is steeped in the political and martial skills needed to survive on and off the battlefields of the 41st millennium. Due to the loss of billions of Imperial soldiers to warp storms and combat attrition, not to mention the fall of Cadia.
Cadia stands!
The Militarum Regimentos at the Lord Commander Solar's command have been severely depleted, even more so with the demand of forces for the Indominus Crusade, despite the parameters that Rabute Gilliman,
the new lord of the Imperium.
yes, that he is, thank you.
Yes, no problem.
Created through his new directives, Leontus has emerged victorious from many political battles with planetary governors, Navis Imperialis admirals, and Officio Logisticarum adepts. With the aid of an entire corps of strategic advisors, cloisters of priests, and the personally maintained stable psychic seers, prophets and emperors' tarot readers known as the Collegiate Astrologics, Leontus has masterminded hundreds of stunning victories. As he sees them, the Lord Solar's duties lie first with the defense of the throne world, then the Sol system, then its neighboring subsectors, and the Segmentum's wider frontiers. A war scholar, polyhistor, and martial tactician of the highest caliber, the Lord Commander Solar's razor-sharp intellect and energetic leadership belie his extensive command experience of more than a standard century. Regiments of costly rejuvenate treatments alongside suites of concealed bionics within his polished, golden carapace armor keep Leontus at his physical peak. Outside battle, however, he endures a weariness of spirit, privately appalled at the horrors he sees constantly perpetrated by the Imperium upon its own people. He has reluctantly authorized many himself, having sent millions of guardsmen into the most terrifying conditions. But Leontus sees such steps as distasteful necessities on a path to ultimate salvation for humanity. With grim pragmatism, the old soldier knows he will not see the hoped-for destination of his works. For him, it is enough that he paves the way. Though Leontus's remit technically ends at the boundaries of the Segmentum Solar, he has led several campaigns beyond. The Lord Commander Solar sees the myths of his predecessor, Saint Macharius, as precedent for this. If prosecuting distant wars will protect Terra, Leontus will not shirk from such duty. Neither does he cower in command bunkers or orbital stratagems. Instead, he is instantly visible from his elevated position upon Constantine, his steed for solar decades, who by now is almost entirely cybernetic. Leontus radiates stern composure and decisive command. For all his talents at the start of the Fourth Tyrannic War in the Era Indomitus, the Lord Commander Solar sought to atone for what he perceived as an unforgivable lapse. When a vast host of cornate demons had assailed Terra soon after the birth of the Great Rift, during the Battle of Lion's Gate, Leontus had been off-world on campaign. by the time he had returned to the throne world, that peril had been vanquished with no aid from him. Humanity's core star systems now faced a terrible new threat with the invasion of High Fleet Leviathan in the Segmentum Pacificus that initiated the Fourth Tyrannic War. And this time, Leontus vowed he would be pivotal in its defeat, even as others such as Trajan Valoris, the Captain General of the Adeptus Custodes, organized the rapid reaction forces of mixed imperial military forces named Soulblades. Leontus was tireless in his own efforts to muster the full but ponderous might of the Astra Militarum. Accompanied by a veritable army of strategos, ecclesiarchy priests, adepts, and military aides, he seems to be everywhere at once. He has bargained, charmed, threatened, and once even dueled to expedite the muster of the Astra Militarum of Segmentum Solar to the best of his abilities to face the Xenos onslaught to come. Now, before we move on to the next notable character, what are your thoughts on the current Lord Commander Solar?
By the way, when you said soul blades for a second, I thought you said soy blades. Yes, those mighty beam warriors.
Soy blades.
Yeah.
Well, now we know what they actually eat.
That's how they get their protein.
They're all lactose intolerant.
No Grox for you. No Grox milk. No. Either that or they do right before battle feed them Grox milk, so they are the fartiest warriors on the planet. Charge!
Nurgle's not the on them.
Nurgle's like, wow, I'm even impressed. Toy blades.
Oh, and before we go farther, just in case anybody else is confused, explain what a stable of psychic seers would be. Because, in my mind, stable, I think of, like a horse stable.
Right. Yeah. It's kind of the same concept with the people, though. Normally the time that I hear that term is when it's talked about in Terran 42. And it's normally, anyways, during the sport known as football. Or actually, it's also been referred to, anyways, when I hear it, anyways, in baseball. And it's normally like a group of people that do the same thing. So in football, normally it's a stable of running backs. That is the way that I've normally heard it described as. In baseball, it's normally a stable of pitchers. Okay. So normally, anyways, that's the way, anyways, that I've always heard described. So, but a stable of psychic seers, this is the first time I've heard that expression used.
And since most cases that you visualize it, you think of something athletic, it really doesn't make much sense when it comes to psychic seers, since most of their images are of old, elderly people with sticks or somewhat raving mad.
Well, okay, maybe it's the concept of. Well, the other thing, though, too, anyways, that both of these are is that one is like I said, a stable of running backs, they all do the same job. Stable pitchers, they all do the same job. The stable of psychic seers, they all do the same job. So, I mean, it's probably a loose term, more slang than anything else. But it works as long as you think about it that way instead of horses.
A gaggle of people. No.
Gaggle of people. Now we're on
that doesn't sound that doesn't sound as good as a stable.
A murder of psychic seers. There you go. We should go with a murder of psychic seers.
Well, anyways, what do you think of Leontus?
He seems like he's trying to fill some really big shoes. Now, I mean, quite frankly, anyways, it seems like he wants to fill the shoes of Macharius. A lot of that, anyways, of what the way that he kind of thinks of things, which is admirable, I think. But at the same time, it's especially in this time period, it ain't going to happen that way. There's just too much stuff going on for him to take the reins like Macharius did. And secondly, though, I will say is that he's also got to deal with something that Macharius never did have to deal with, which was a Primarch.
Well,
Which
that and the Great Rift, but
yeah, both of those.
and
So,
yeah, the High Fleet Leviathan.
well, okay,
Yeah.
the Tyranids were around during the time of Macharius, but they weren't. You didn't have a High Fleet steaming in. Yeah, good point. But so I guess, like I said, anyways, is that he's trying to fill these shoes, but at the same time, I don't think that he ever will, just simply because one of the main reasons is, like we just discussed, just the time period. He just doesn't have the mobility that Macharius did. Macharius was during the time of the waning. So, I mean, everything was slowly starting to shrink on the Imperium, but there was no like gigantic forces that were in effect, multiple gigantic
Pushing
forces at the
against
same time. Was that?
There wasn't anything immediately pushing against them
Well,
or
there weren't
pressing them.
multiple things. I mean, like for instance, right before the Macharius Crusade, the 12th Black Crusade took place. The Gothic War took place. So, I mean, it's not like nothing was going on. It was kind of like onesie twosie things, anyways, were taking place that the Imperium could take care of. As
Right.
opposed to right now during the Indominus era, where you've got, like you said, anyways, High Fleet Leviathan, the Great Rift, Abaddon's still out there plotting something. I think at this point, anyways, hasn't what's his face? The guy who's in charge of the Deathborn. No, not Deathborn. Death Guard. Didn't he show up too, anyways, and try to take out Macrog?
I am not sure
Mortarion.
about that.
Mortarion, anyways, during the Plague Wars has taken place during this time. So there's a lot of stuff going on right now that is like really them just trying to beat it back with a stick. So the concept of going gallivanting out there anyways and trying to take over a huge chunk of space it's just not going to happen. I mean,
well, it sounds like though also he realizes that, and through his mindset, it's like, okay, this is how it should be though, is first focus on Terra, neighbors, and expand out like that.
Right.
So if everything's safe at these different areas, then it should be going the next step further out.
Which Yuksen, I think, is a very good point. Like I said, I think he's trying to fill Macharius' shoes, but I think, like you said, anyways, I think he realizes that he can't. Yeah. So he's trying to become his own thing, which I think is actually far more admirable than trying to just follow the same footsteps as somebody else. Now, like I said, though, the one big difference, though, anyways, between the two is quite frankly, Guilliman. He has to answer to a Primarch. I mean, Macharius, say what you will about him, anyways. I mean, he was also a war master, so the concept of the High Lords of Terra, anyways, to telling him what to do was almost like, yeah, no, it ain't happening. So, I mean,
well, why would they? He was going to be increasing their profits.
Gold, yes. So, but like I said, anyways, the new guy on the block, anyways, has to deal with Rabute Guilliman. So because you did more research on this guy, anyways, how is their relationship? How do they work together?
The relationship doesn't seem particularly like much, which can make sense since he's kind of stuck in the solar area while the Indominus Crusade is reaching towards the Great Rift in those areas. Right. So they're kind of separate from each other. So I don't see them really having much contact or much of a really relationship between each other, so to speak.
Well, probably okay, I'm not talking about like a personal relationship. I'm talking about like a work relationship. Because like you said, I wholeheartedly agree anyways. Rabute Guilliman is out there trying to fix the whole Great Rift, which is a feat in and of its own. And at the same time, run the High Lords of Terra. So
I think on a character level, he doesn't really have anything plus or minus.
No, not like a character level. I mean like as a work concept.
Do think, though, he should be a little bit irritated with the fact that he's facing all these different things, and then now he's having his what forces he does have being sapped because of recruitments for the Indominus Crusade.
Okay, do you think he's irritated about that, or do you think do you think he's irritated about it and it's kind of becoming kind of a thorn, or do you think it's more of he's irritated about it but he understands why it's taking place?
I think the latter of the two. And then also another thing that probably also may have been, at least originally, frustrating is the fact that he's actually been around longer than Gilliman's been awake.
Okay. I thought you were about to say longer than Gilliman. I was like, I don't think so. Gilliman's been around since the Emperor. But longer than he's been around awake, okay, I'll buy that. But
so also all of a sudden being set these new parameters after he's like ingrained in himself, okay, these are the ways to get around these different things.
right.
It's like, oh, now you have new rules you have to follow. It's like,
No.
great.
But okay, let me put it this way. I
know
think
all the loopholes. Not anymore.
Let me put it this way. I don't think that their work relationship is incredibly hostile.
No.
I'm sure.
I don't think that.
Like you said, anyways, I think the Lord Solar, anyways, he might be frustrated that he has to follow a bunch of new rules. The stuff, a lot of stuff that he has done, anyways, has kind of been thrown out the window, and he has to give a lot of his forces over to Gilliman, who is doing the Indominus Crusade. Yeah. At the same time, anyways, I mean, Gilliman left him back as the Solar Commander, so there's got to be some sort of trust there, anyways, with at least Gilliman, anyways, going, okay, I think you can still do this job. Because if he didn't, I mean, Gilliman has all the power, anyways, to go, you're out.
Yeah.
You're coming with me crusading, and we're going to put somebody else in charge. I mean, he could have done that, but he didn't.
Yeah.
He kept him there. And
I actually think that's partially because one of the things we do know about, well, maybe not originally how he perceived the characters of other people, but more recently how he's perceived them. I think he was able to see the fact that this is somebody who's trying to at least keep humanity's survival going.
You talking about Gilliman?
Yeah.
Okay.
That Leontus is trying to actually keep everything cohesive and connected together, and that he's been doing it for a while, and he seems to at least be somewhat successful at it.
Well, not only that, but the other thing that you were talking about, anyways, is that. Oh, hang on, have a second, Yuksen. One of the things that you talked about was the fact that he doesn't like where the Imperium is right now.
Yeah, that's what I was about to say.
Yeah, the Lord Solar just does not like it. He's just like we wasted too many people.
He sees empathy. That's the other thing. He sees empathy on this person instead of being like a lot of the High Lords of Terra, which look at as like, oh well, you know.
Well, I don't know necessarily if it's not just empathy. I think he also looks at it as it's being wasteful.
No, I'm talking about the characteristics that.
No. What I'm saying is that the Lord Solar, I think not only does he look at it with some empathy, because you can't be incredibly empathetic when you're a general, because anyways people under you are going to die.
Yeah,
because if you do have to put them in dangerous situations, but at the same time, anyways, I do think he does have some empathy for his soldiers. But at the same time, I think, anyways, the way that he looks at the High Lords of Terra is that he looks at them and he goes, "What they're doing is wasteful.
Yeah,
it is not effective." And I think, quite frankly, that is one of the reasons why Gilliman left him behind, so that he could kind of keep an eye on the High Lords of Terra and keep things, anyways, moving in the right direction.
Probably he didn't even have to look at any of the other things. He could have just walked up and said, "What do you think of the High Lords of Terra?" "Well, I think they suck. I'm going to leave you here." Just walk off. Think about it. Who did he put in charge of? Left in charge of the Adeptus Sororitas? Well, somebody was placed in charge who is one of the High Lords of Terra, but really doesn't follow the same things, and she doesn't really care about the High Lords of Terra herself.
Didn't she go off crusading with Gilliman?
Yeah, I think so.
So, yeah. So, I mean, I think, anyways, like I said, I think that it's not a hostile work relationship. I think it's more, anyways, that they do kind of see eye to eye. Now, like you said, anyways, I think the Lord Solar is a little irritated that he has to change because people don't like changing. But I think also, anyways, that he's looking at it on the concept of like what you said before, anyways. He's looking at it and he's going, don't want to change this. In fact, I came up with a lot of these rules, but I get it. It's necessary.
For me, what would probably be the most frustrating thing in his position is the fact that he now has these additional things he's having to juggle around, and then all of a sudden it's like, we need to take some more of your forces. It's like, but I need them here and here. But we need them.
We need them.
But
and
I need them here and here. Great. Now I need to figure out a new freaking way to do it.
You're a smart cookie. You can figure it out.
I mean, you have a stable of high seers, psychic seers, and tarot readers. I mean,
back to the stable. Well,
tarot
so we have talked about a couple of high-ranking officers here. I mean, some of the greatest. I mean, they're Lord Solar Commanders. The next guy that I want to talk about, he actually has one of my favorite stories, and this would be Poul Marlin. Now, Sergeant Poul Marlin was an honorable and competent sergeant in the 10th Slavic Imperial Guard Regiment. I know, another Guard regiment that we actually don't have the time to talk about today, but just know that he was part of the Slavic Imperial Guard Regiment. As a non-commissioned officer, he knew how to lead and motivate his platoon of men, but he was also very humane and did everything he could to keep his men alive and out of harm. As a veteran, he was fully aware that despair was the guardsman's worst enemy. So he made sure he kept his men focused and as motivated as possible. Marlin was also a courageous man, never flinching when faced with the horrors of the Tyranids, nor hesitating to stand up to an Astartes to defend his opinion. Now, his most notable work was on the ice world of Shadrach. And it is, I will say anyways, one of my favorite stories, involving one of my favorite groups of Astartes. Now, when the ice world of Shadrach came under attack by the Tyranids, the 10th Slavic Regiment of the Imperial Guard was deployed to stop the deadly Xenos. Their efforts proved insufficient, and one standard month after their deployment, Poul Marlin gathered the 200 survivors of his regiments together and led them in a retreat towards the nearest Imperial outpost. Now, you're probably wondering how much a score is, because it's a word that's not often used.
I used to remember it. Let's see. You'll have to remind me.
It's 20 men. So he had 40 men at his command at this point. Getting back to this. Having lost all contact with their superiors, proceeding on foot through the deadly frost, and with their food rations critically low, the Slavic soldiers were demoralized. But Sergeant Marlin kept them going, putting on a facade of optimism to prevent his men from despairing and simply laying down to die, carried away by the gentle but deadly hand of hypothermia. The Tyranids, though, would not let them die so easily, and the survivors soon found themselves under attack by fast-moving swarms of rippers and homogods. Poul Marlin led his troops in a running defense, keeping his men moving, and they managed to beat back the small swarm while losing only 2 of their own. Things still look grim, however, for the Tyranids had their scent, and the humans would soon have to stop for the night. Marlin gathered his men at a rocky outcropping and made them form a half circle. Expecting this to be their last stand, the Slavic soldiers ate their last food and burnt their last fuel, waiting for the Tyranids to close in for the kill. When the last fuel burned out, the humans commended their souls to the Emperor of Mankind as total darkness fell. Yet, instead of hearing the hisses and chitinous creak of moving Tyranids, the survivors were deafened by the loud bark of bolter fire. The bewildered guardsmen peered into the surrounding darkness, catching glimpses of giants in gray power armor, slaughtering Tyranids through the stroboscopic effect of their bolters' muzzle flashes. No Tyranid managed to reach the sheltered humans. And when hours later the sun rose, the astonished guardsmen could only stare at the slaughterhouse scene that confronted them. The frozen plain was littered with blasted, exploded, or eviscerated Tyranid bodies. But of their Astartes saviors, there was no sign. Marlin forced his men and himself to ignore the Astartes' strange behavior. With neither fuel nor food left, they now had to make it to the outpost with all due haste before the murderous night fell again and froze them all to death. Gathering his men about him, Marlin set out with all possible speed, and the survivors ultimately reached the outpost in the nick of time. Although the forced march would claim 3 of their numbers, things began to look up for the survivors, as the outpost was still intact and provided them with shelter, water, and fuel to burn so they could get warm. Alas, the remaining food stores had rotted away, so food remained a problem for the Slavic men. The much-needed warmth and rest restored some of the guardsmen's morale, and when one of the soldiers reported the presence of a functional Chimera APC in the outpost, Marlin rejoiced and decided that in the morning they would embark in search of the Astartes they had glimpsed the day before. The night proved bitter, however, for one of the famished soldiers chanced to eat the rotten food, became delusional. In his madness, he severely wounded two of his comrades before running out of the base. Marlin ordered his men to prepare the chimeras while he went after their crazed fellow soldier. His rescue attempt would prove futile, however, for Harmagon had gotten to the man first. Hissing in fury, the Gaunt launched himself at Marlin, but was caught in flight by a well-aimed bolter shell, and the bewildered Marlin dazedly turned his gaze from the remains of his would-be killer to his savior, glimpsing again a gigantic warrior in power armor who nodded at him before disappearing. Marlin returned to the outpost and had his men mount up in the chimeras. The three vehicles then set out with their auspex running, in hope of finding the Astartes. What they found instead was another swarm of Gaunts, who attempted to overwhelm the chimeras. This time, however, the guardsmen had enough firepower at their disposal, and they held their own, cutting swaths through the Tyranid creatures. And then suddenly, three Astarte bikers shot out of the mist and added their close-quarter prowess to the guardsmen' firepower. The swarm was quickly routed. Marlin ordered a full stop and jumped down from his chimera to greet and thank the Space Marines. But their leader only barked at him to go away quickly. Dumbfounded, Marlin gazed in the same direction as the other two Astartes and watched with horror as a Carnifex charged out of the midst. The Gaunts had sacrificed themselves to slow the humans down and allow the larger bioform to join the fray. Marlin mounted his APC again, watching in fascination as the Space Wolves prepared to face the Screamer Killer. At first he gave the order to run for it, but the decision rankled him, and moments later he ordered his three APCs around and grabbed the last remaining missile launcher. Reaching the battle once again, he calmly adjusted his aim and shot a crack missile straight down the Carnifex's maw, which blasted out the back of the gigantic Tyranid's skull and killed it instantly. After the snow had settled, Marlin introduced himself to the leader of the Space Wolves, who named himself Skold Greypelt. The Slavic soldiers then followed the Space Wolves back to their encampment. To their astonishment, they were treated to a traditional Fenrisian feast, and the Space Marines building a large bonfire and breaking out casks of Fenrisian ale. The Space Wolves explained this was a funerary feast for the Space Wolf biker who had been mortally wounded by the Carnifex. When Marlin dared to ask if the Space Wolves were not afraid that the fire would attract the Tyranids, he was answered with roars of laughter, growls that the Space Wolves feared nothing, and the assurance that attracting Tyranids was the whole point of the Space Wolves' presence on Shadrach. Greypelt explained to Marlin the way of the Space Wolves, and explained that while Shadrach was lost to the Imperium, they could still make the Tyranids pay a steep price for it. After having feasted, the Space Wolves and the remaining guardsmen took up defensive positions, and battle was soon joined, as wave after wave of lesser Tyranid bioforms threw themselves at the stubborn defenders, who slaughtered them in droves with volleys from their las guns and bolters, before cutting those few that managed to reach them to pieces. Yet the valiant defenders eventually ran out of ammunition, and Greypelt called in his Thunderhawk, upon which the surviving Astartes and guardsmen hurriedly embarked. As the last living defenders departed the doomed world, the critically wounded Space Wolf laid down on his funeral cairn, and with a last shout of defiance, detonated the nuclear weapon that had been buried within it. A cataclysmic explosion that was seen by the survivors from orbit ravaged the surrounding swarms, incinerating thousands of Tyranids and denying their biomatter to the hive mind forever. Shadrach had fallen, but the hive mind had paid in blood and ichor for it. The survivors' trials were not yet over, however. The Tyranid fleet had forced the Imperial Navy and the Space Wolf ship out of the system, leaving the Thunderhawk stranded above the dying planet. The prospect of a slow death by asphyxiation made the surviving guardsmen become restless and agitated, and Sergeant Marlin had to step in and restore discipline, lest fights break out. Marlin assigned his men to man the dropship auspex stations and report anything that could be of use. Once again, the Emperor seemed to protect the survivors of the Slavic 10th, for they quickly identified a possible solution for their predicament. By scanning a space hulk that had somehow followed the Tyranid fleet in system, they identified a recent addition to it, an Eris pattern fleet tender.
Huh?
A light cruiser
Ah.
from the Imperial fleet that had crashed against it. Auspex scans showed that the tender's bridge and reaction drives were intact. So the guardsmen reasoned that if they managed to sever it from the Space Hulk's main mass using demolition charges without damaging the vessel too much, they could use the blind jump through the warp towards the nearest Imperial outpost. Marlin realized it was their best chance of survival and presented his findings to the Space Wolves. It was met by reluctance by Trungulus, the Space Wolves' Iron Priest.
An Iron Priest is more or less Tech Marine in other Star Wars chapters.
Yes. Thank you for mentioning that, Yuksen. Anyways, where was I? Yes. Reluctantly, the Iron Priest Trungulus acknowledged that the plan was feasible, but he had grave concerns about angering the fleet tender's machine spirit. Keeping calm, Marlin stood his ground before the grumbling Astartes, and they decided that the guardsmen would install the demolition charges, and then wait for the Iron Priest to finish the necessary rituals before detonating them. Gathering his men, Marlin gave them a rousing motivational speech, saying that they would only have one shot at escaping and assigning them tasks. His speech seemed to amuse Scold Greypelt, but when Marlin asked why, the Space Wolf simply told him to continue. The guardsmen and the Astartes then quickly went to work, but trouble erupted when they encountered a party of orcs from another part of the Space Hulk. The Greenskins were intent on looting this new addition to their home and eagerly seized the chance to do battle. Marlin's small party defended themselves mightily, but they fell one by one to the orcs' choppers, until only Sergeant Marlin remained, barely keeping the Greenskins at bay with bursts from his bolt pistol. He was saved in the nick of time by his friend Greypelt, who joined the battle while savagely swinging his power axe and cutting the Xenos into little green pieces. Greypelt burst out laughing when Marlin reminded him that they only had one shot at taking the ship, happily countering that life itself represents a single shot, and at that, the only thing that mattered was making that one shot count. Both warriors then made a fighting retreat towards the fleet tender's access hatch, buying the necessary time for Trungulus to complete the needed rituals. Once completed, they jumped through the hatch and detonated the charges, which liberated their new starship from the Space Hulk's mass and allowing them to escape. As the fleet tender moved away under its own power, Marlin collapsed from sheer exhaustion and remarked in a daze that he was down to his last bolt pistol shell. The Space Wolf barked out in laughter, joyfully telling his friend once again that one shot was all he would ever need. Well, what do you think of Marlin's story, brother?
Well, first off, it was wonderfully told.
Thank you.
And secondly, I find it interesting how Marlin ended up being the only one left.
That's usually the way that it goes, right?
Yeah, I know.
Hard.
You know,
It's normally only one left.
I find it interesting also how Sergeant was in charge of any group over 10.
Well, as I mentioned before, anyways, he was the only guy left that had a command, which is kind of saying something too. I mean, it sounds like, anyways, these 40 men was like groups from all sorts of different regiments that they just kind of picked up along the way. That's kind of the way that I kind of read that. If that makes sense. And he was the only guy, anyways, that was sergeant. Everybody else was underneath that, which says something too. I mean, like I described at the beginning, anyways, the Imperial Guard, the Slavic 10th, anyways, were wiped out. There was like nobody left,
Right.
other than the 40 guys. So
I do think, them being Slav makes me think that they are also Ice Worlders, but it's always interesting to find when there are characters that actually, Imperial Guardsmen that end up actually befriending Space Marines.
yeah,
Or just normal humans in general.
it's normally fairly unusual. Although it does seem to, and from what I've read, anyways, it does seem, anyways, to happen more often with one of two groups, either the Space Wolves or the Salamanders.
Yeah.
The most bizarre one I can think of, quite frankly, actually was, and we'll probably talk about this in a couple months when we talk about Armageddon, but the chaplain for the Black Knights or Black Templars. Sorry, my bad. kind of getting a begrudging respect for a couple of leaders, anyways, for the Hive City in Armageddon.
Okay.
I can't remember the chaplain's name for the life of me, unfortunately. He's actually, it's based off of a book, and they did a YouTube video on it, and both were very good. But for the life of me, I can't remember his name.
He's probably a noble character. So
he's the guy that we will probably talk about. But that one was probably the most bizarre to me, just simply because it's the Black Templar. I think we made a joke at one point, anyways, that an Ultramarine would move around or jump over a guardsman to get to the enemy. A salamander would stand in front of a guardsman so that they couldn't get at the guardsman. And a Black Templar would step on the guardsman to get to the enemy. So I think I got that right.
And then as the Marine Malavents would purposely stomp on top of them.
Marines Malevolent would just start firing at the enemy behind the guardsman and just take out everybody in front of him. But okay, so we got only a little bit of time left. I figured, anyways. Well, you had one more guy you wanted to talk about, right?
Yeah, since we are running a bit long today, how about I briefly talk about Mogul Kamir?
Ooh, he's a good one. Yeah, sure.
On the feudal world of Attila, where it is normal for warriors to fight from horseback, the Imperial recruits mounted regiments of the Imperial Guardsmen known as Rough Riders. The Attilan Rough Riders are recruited from such a world where fierce nomadic tribes and warrior horse lodges have perfected the art of cavalry techniques through thousands of tearing years of bloodshed. It is said that Attilans are born in the saddle, for they are amongst the greatest horsemen in the galaxy. The Attilan breed of horses they prefer are thick-set beasts, ill-tempered and likely to bite or kick anyone unwise enough to give them a chance to do so. Mogul Kamir is such a man. Like his fellow tribesmen, Kamir is proud and aloof, except in combat, when he turns into a snarling daredevil, oblivious to mortal danger. Mogul Kamir is a renowned warrior who is more daring and bloodthirsty than any of his fellow Attilans, though. He rose to take control of his tribe by the age of 13 after killing his uncle, the chief, in single combat. By age 15, Kamir was ruler over 20 tribes by right of conquest, yet he still lusted for combat in a way that could not be sated. Looking for a greater challenge, he sought counsel with the king of Kanasan, the lord of Attila. The wise king spoke of the glorious Imperial Guard armies of the Emperor, which offered the fiery young warrior a lifetime of battle across the galaxy, with more foes to test his skills than could ever be found on their homeworld. Kamir nodded with a grin, accepted this new challenge. As a fierce warrior and a natural leader, Kamir easily rose to a position of leadership of his own squadron of Rough Riders. Mogul Kamir's squadron is one of the Kanasan's fiercest mounted charges within all of the Imperial Guard regiments. His headstrong attitude often sees him recklessly charging the enemy. Kamir's body is testament of pain and a lifetime of battle, riddled with scar tissue and other signs of uncounted notable endeavors in the heat of battle. Many a warlord's skulls adorns his massive hunting lance, both a testament to his courage and a proclamation of his skills as Attila's greatest warrior. Now, Mogul Kamir lives for the thrill of battle and has a predilection for danger. Very few of those that fight beside him remain unmarked by blade or blast. Though many never return from accompanying him into battle, that does not stop those among the Attilan Rough Riders from ritually dueling for the right to ride with Mogul Kamir into the heart of battle. His lust for combat is a matter of pride amongst the Attilans, and only the fiercest and most skilled warriors are allowed to ride with him. Kamir possesses a short and extremely violent temper. This attitude reinforces his barbaric appearance, but those that can see past the tribal scars and savage-looking fetishes Find a courageous and cunning ally who has the ability to turn the tide of battle with a single charge. It is a fool indeed who fails to show the Tillen chief the proper respect. So, what are your thoughts on this vicious fighter?
You would have made a great white score. Don't you think?
Well, one of the things that pops in my mind is I'm wondering if just in the mindset of the Lord of Attila just went, I gotta get rid of this guy. I know. Let's send him into the Imperial Guard. Perfect.
But yeah, no, I wholeheartedly agree. I think he was thinking about it and going, if he stays here for any longer, he's going to take my job and my head. I think we should send him off to the Imperial Guard. But it was kind of a win-win.
I think he may become a bit too self-destructive, and then I may start losing people that I kind of need.
Or I guess he could have been thinking that, but I think it was more along the lines of he was trying to keep his own head. But like I said, though, it was kind of a win-win situation, though.
Yeah.
I mean, he did get rid of this guy. At the same time, seems like Mogul has never been happier.
Yeah.
He's just got he will never run out of enemies. He did speak truth. Will never, ever run out of enemies. And on that note, we're out of time. Sorry I went a little long this, folks, but I hope you enjoyed this box. So much so that you join us next week on our conclusion of the Imperial Guard, and hopefully we'll have our special guest, Sychrona, joining us.
Awesome! Wait a minute. Are you sure you will be able to make it this time?
As sure as I have the last 2 times.
Excellent. Wait a minute.
Now, if you're still listening to this, then if you could be so kind as to push that subscribe, like, or follow button, and if you wish to help us expand our work on 40k lore, by all means, support us by joining our membership program on our YouTube channel, Tales of Ashraka.
Yes, and most importantly, have a great day. And until next time, this is Yuksen
And Zeckthar.
signing off.